Hi, this is Pastor Lutzer. Thank you so much for joining me today as I speak on the topic of COVID-19, the economy, and our future. As a matter of fact, the subtitle could be 5 Continuing Economic Effects of COVID-19. All of us know how the world changed in February of 2020 when this virus, which was begun in China, suddenly spread throughout the world. And effectively, most of our economy was shut down. I can't believe it, but the stadiums were empty and the restaurants were closed down. Airlines had very few passengers. And I don't know of any other time in history when an economy was shut down by government decree. Normally it happens because of a recession or bad management, but we were told to shelter in place. And what an experience that has been. But I believe that there were certain ripples that were begun, and now I'm talking about economic ripples, that will be with us for a long time. Let me get to these very quickly. First of all, I want to say that there is the continuing effects of fear. People panicked. And when people are afraid, what they do is they draw back. They no longer engage their culture. Oftentimes, people begin to hoard things because there is a great difference between a pandemic and something even like war. When war is over, we know that it's time to rebuild, but the panic that took place as a result of COVID, I think, is going to continue. People don't know how to handle the future. And what that means is they begin to hoard their resources, fearing the future. Oftentimes, entrepreneurship begins to decline as people begin to think about the uncertainties that they believe may be coming. Who could have predicted that all this would happen? But I want to begin by reminding you that fear is not an option for those of us who are worshiping Jesus. We need to be encouraged, and the kind of faith that we need is not the kind of faith that you often hear about, namely, if you have faith, everything is going to work out, your job is going to come back, you won't get sick. No. Especially at the end of this talk, I'm going to be giving you a kind of encouragement for faith that is actually able to keep us all the way to the finish line despite unanswered prayers and one setback after another. But I want to remind you that COVID-19 is not out of God's control. As a matter of fact, if COVID-19 were out of God's hand, then I would be out of God's hand, because after all, any one of us could die of COVID, or we could die some other way. Death has many interesting ways to bedevil us and eventually send us to the grave. May I remind you of the words of Jesus, who said, "Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they?" Years ago, I memorized this little poem. Said the robin to the sparrow, "I would really like to know why those anxious human beings run around and worry so." Said the sparrow to the robin, "I think it must be they have no heavenly Father such as cares for you and me." If you're afraid, remember this. It is very difficult for us to believe in the presence of God and fear at the same time. All of us oftentimes are overcome by fear. I understand that. But this is a time when we need to cleave to the promises of God, no matter how difficult it gets, and react to what has been happening very differently than the people of the world. That's the first continuing effect. Let me give you a second continuing effect, and that is simply the lasting effects of government dependency. All of us know that the Congress approved $2.2 trillion and created that money, and they did it in order to support those who were out of work, to prop up businesses, unemployment, and so forth. You know, it's easy for us to speak about that, but let us remember that $1 trillion is 1,000 billion. And as a result of this, many people have become government dependent. Now, maybe it was the right thing to do to prop up the economy because so many people were out of work, millions out of work. The problem is that oftentimes when that happens, people begin to depend upon the government. And that kind of dependency is very difficult to break. As a matter of fact, we don't look to the Washington Journal, do we, for most of our news, or I should say, yes, the Washington Post. We don't look to it for most of our news, but there was a very interesting article by a man by the name of Gary Abernathy. He writes, "The coronavirus shows Bernie Sanders won." And then he says, "We have crossed the Rubicon. When historians record the moment that the United States transitioned from a free market capitalism to democratic socialism, they will point to this week. Watching it all unfold has been like witnessing a plane crash in slow motion. When the smoke clears, what's left will be a feeble relic of the United States we once knew." He concludes, "We are all socialists now." Well, I think he's wrong. We are not socialists now. After all, the government hasn't taken over businesses and the means of production. But let me tell you that whenever government dependency is expanded, in fact, I've heard of more people actually saying that they are being paid better by unemployment than they were at their business and their job. Whenever that happens, laziness oftentimes is rewarded. As I've already mentioned, entrepreneurship oftentimes is cut back. Crime begins to skyrocket. And as a result of that, we need to understand that we might be opening the door to a brand new reality. And the question is, are we ready for it? Rebecca and I were actually visiting in Russia before the Berlin Wall fell. And we knew that there was a shortage of food. People were being paid by the government, but they couldn't live on government subsidies. And yet every evening we had this wonderful meal prepared for us. And I said to somebody, "Where is all this food coming from?" He said, "In the midst of this, what happens is this. During times of difficulty, everybody brings something, and we unite. And that's how come we can have a meal like the one that we have prepared here." You know, days like that might be coming. We have to remind ourselves that the Church of Jesus Christ is not based on capitalism. It is, after all, based upon the foundation of Jesus. And the Church of Christ has had to survive in the midst of all kinds of economic ups and downs. And that's perhaps where we are going to find ourselves. I found it very interesting that a man in Romania, a pastor, said this. He said, during the time under communism, 90% of our people survived the restrictions and the government oppression. But after freedom came, he said, 90% of the people lost their passion for God. Only 10% were able to survive prosperity. My friend, it has been my observation that it is almost impossible to develop true worshipers of God in the midst of affluence. We have no idea what the future holds. We do know this: people are going to continue to want government dependency to continue. We've begun down that road. Let me give you a third effect, and that is simply this: the powerlessness of fiat money. Are you acquainted with that word fiat? It means in Latin, literally, it means let it be done. Going back to the $2.2 trillion that the government created, how did they do it? They did it electronically. They moved some numbers around on a computer and lo and behold, out of nowhere, trillions of dollars were created. That began a thought process in my mind, and I began to ask myself the question, a very important question, namely, What really is money? And of course, as you already know, money has no value in and of itself. Its value is derived from the fact that people trust it. They trust that you can go to a store and the dollar will work. The money can be changed into something else, but it has no special value of itself. Years ago, I remember reading a story about some gold miners who were actually caught in a very bad snowstorm and had to spend the winter in a small cottage up north, and they starved to death with gold on the table. So unless money is taken and transmuted into something else, as I will explain, it of itself has no value. Now, money is very deceptive because it makes all the same promises that God makes. It says, I'll be with you in life or death. Well, COVID proved to us that ultimately money cannot save us. The rich died along with the poor. Now, of course, the rich can survive these things more easily. I understand that. And I also understand that money is very important. We need it to pay our bills, we need to pay the rent, we need to buy food, we need to clothe our children. But let us remember this, that money can never keep all of its promises. Mark Zuckerberg said that he is investing all of his money to end disease by the end of this century. But even if he were to end all disease, he will never be able to end death. Many years ago, I had a very interesting experience here in Chicago. I was with a guide who took me to several cemeteries and explained these cemeteries in ways that I shall never forget. The thing that I remember is that in one part of the cemetery, you had people die who all that was on their tombstone were their dates and their names. And even those were faded. And the other part of the cemetery, there were these mausoleums with all kinds of tributes to the dead. And then I went over to where, and he took me to where communist rioters were buried. And they were in the same cemeteries where some of the 19th century entrepreneurs were buried. Names that you might know. But the thing that united them all was they were all united in death. Money can only do so much. I want to share my heart with you about money. And that is this: it must be taken and transmuted. Let me introduce you to that word, transmuted. To transmute something means that you take it from one form and you actually change its substance. For example, if you have a sick child, you don't say, well, my child is sick, here, here's a $50 bill. Let's feed the money to the child. No, you take the $50, you go to a drugstore, and you get some medicine. That's transmutation. You are changing it into something that it isn't. This is what Jesus talked about in the 16th chapter of the book of Luke. He said, use your money and invest it in such a way that there will be people who will meet you in heaven and welcome you into everlasting habitations. I don't think there's ever anything that Jesus ever said that has motivated me to give that is more powerful. Jesus is saying that what you have to do is to use your money wisely and transmute it. That's what he meant when he said, lay up treasures in heaven where moth and rust doth not corrupt. And you and I must remember that. Years ago, a man in Canada gave me a book entitled The Day the Dollar Dies by Willard Cantillon. Cantillon was trying to establish a school in Germany after World War II. And inflation was very rampant during that period of time. And he tells this story. He said, a German mother wanting to assist the Bible school brought her gift of 10,000 marks for the building program. She held her money with pride and tenderness as if it were a part of her very life, and in a literal sense it was. She had worked hard. She earned the money. She guarded it constantly during the war. She beamed with pride as she offered her contribution. Cantillon continues, and he said, I had to tell her a sad fact. He writes, how could I tell her that she had held this money too long? Why did it fall to my lot to shock this sensitive soul with the news that her money was virtually worthless? Why had she not read the morning newspaper or heard the announcement that the new government in Bonn had canceled this currency? Madam, I said slowly, I'm awful sorry to tell you, but I cannot accept your money. As gently as I could, I said, it has been canceled. Almost brings tears to your eyes to think of this dear lady, but if she had brought it even a month earlier, they'd have been able to use it, to invest it, maybe buy some building supplies, maybe feed some people. But because it was canceled, it was of no value whatever. Let me share my heart with you, my dear friend, because let us remember that the American dollar will someday be canceled. Just read the New Testament and you'll understand that the day is coming when everything is going to melt and the elements will melt with fervent heat. The American dollar will be canceled. It is at this time in our lives when it can be still transmuted into something that is lasting. And during these critical times, I encourage you to continue to give. Rebecca and I continue to give to the Moody Church here because we are members. We continue to support missionaries around the world. That's really one of my greatest burdens, because go any place in the world and you will find that the ministries that are preaching the gospel are dependent on American funds. I don't know about you. I hope it's true of you that what you really want to do is to have some people in heaven say, part of the reason I'm here. Now, of course, it isn't the whole reason by any means, but part of the reason I'm here is because you transmuted your funds into something that was everlasting, and you did it before your money was canceled. Let me give you a fourth continuing effect, and that is the triumph of ideology over science, law, and civil rights. Let me read that again. The triumph of ideology over science, law, and civil rights. Let me ask you a question. Who made the decision as to what was essential and what was non-essential? Liquor stores were deemed as essential. So were marijuana shops. Abortion clinics, essential. But other kinds of procedures, a heart stent or some other necessary medical procedure, non-essential. Clothing stores, non-essential. As a matter of fact, one governor said that you could go into a store and buy food, but even if in the same store there were garden supplies, you couldn't buy that. Who made those decisions, and on what basis were they made? Were they driven by science, or were they driven by ideology? Let me give you even a clearer example. After the death of George Floyd, and let me tell you, his death was absolutely horrible. I remember watching it and just wanting to shout, "No, stop, you can't do that." What a horrible way for a man to die. Terrible experience in American history. But after that, we had protesters, and many of them were very legitimate. They had legitimate concerns, but all of us know that those protesters were soon taken over also by radicals. And the incident was used for the radicals to accomplish their agenda. Well, remember how we were told we should not go outside without a mask and we should social distance? Isn't this interesting? An article on CNN on June 5th was titled, "Over 1,000 health professionals have signed a letter saying, 'Don't shut down the protests using coronavirus concerns as an excuse.'" We created this letter in response to the emerging narrative that seemed to malign demonstrators as risky for the public health because of COVID-19. Instead, we wanted to present a narrative that prioritizes opposition to racism as vital to public health. Well, wait a moment now. During the COVID crisis, what you find was that there were some people who could not even have a funeral for their loved ones. And now suddenly, because of the ideology of racism, that trumped all kinds of medical suggestions, rules, and laws. The triumph of ideology. I want to share my heart with you for a moment about something. When you look at a revolution, how do revolutions happen? First of all, there's an event that sparks them, but then following that, you have three components of a revolution. First of all, you have an ideology, and that has to trump everything. Everything has to be submissive to the ideology. And then what you have is demonstrators, or you have those who are willing to promote that ideology under the name of justice and righteousness, or the common good. And then third, what you have to do is to shut down all opposition. No one can go against this ideology without being condemned, shunned, etc. And that's exactly what has happened. Take, for example, this headline: the Philadelphia Inquirer top editor Stan Wishanowski resigns. Why did he resign? He allowed an article in his newspaper entitled "Buildings Matter Too." Now, I read that article. It was written by a woman, very well reasoned. What she said was that, indeed, lives are more important than buildings, but buildings matter too. And so she talked about all of the violence and the looting in Philadelphia. Well, that sparked a feud, a backlash. After all, this somehow diminished the protesters. You're not allowed for an article like that to appear in your newspaper, so the top editor resigned. Here's another headline from Chicago: if you value the reputation of your restaurant, maybe you should stop serving cops. How do you like that? Restaurants targeted for serving policemen. And then what about Drew Brees, the quarterback of the Saints? He made the statements, "I love my teammates and stand with them against racial injustice." And he said he was in favor of equality. But then he said, "I would never agree with anyone disrespecting the flag. We still have a long way to go, but I think that what you do by standing there and showing respect to the flag with your hand over your heart shows unity. It shows that we are all in this together, we can all do better, and we are all part of the solution." Sounds very innocuous, but the fuse was lit. The fuse was lit. The pushback was so severe that he had to apologize not once, but twice. And then maybe you didn't get the instance regarding Alexander Katai from Serbia. Now, he played for the U.S. Major Soccer League. And his wife wrote a blog, a social media message in Serbian, in which she was critical of the protesters. It was deemed racist. He apologized on her behalf and said that what she wrote was unacceptable. That wasn't enough. He was fired. Fired for something that he himself did not write, but his wife wrote it. Somebody translated it from Serbian into English, and he was gone. And if you read the newspaper, you discover that the league says this was not a difficult decision because we cannot tolerate any kind of hate, any kind of racial impressions. And then we have the defund the police movement. Let me ask you something. How did we get in America from the idea that the real threat to America are the police, not criminals? Well, some of you might say that some of the police are criminals, and a few are, but the vast majority are trying to do their job to the best of their ability. I want to commend our mayor here in the city of Chicago because she said that she would not even entertain the idea of defunding the police. Good for her. And many mayors throughout the country have said that. But this whole idea, which has caught on, and saner voices, of course, are overriding what some of the radicals are saying. This whole idea is based on this notion that if we do not have police, it's not that no one will be in charge. It is that the radicals will be in charge. And they'll be able to loot and pillage and burn. They'll be able to loot rich neighborhoods, and no one will stand in their way. And they'll all be done under the name of justice, to be sure. Everything is just. You know, what we have witnessed here in America has made me less critical of some of the criticisms that we have made against the Church of Jesus Christ in previous revolutions. We've said to ourselves, well, where was the church? Where was its voice? Well, the answer is that very often Christians bowed for the same reason that we've just explained here during this time when we have a mob mentality. Christians bow. Some bow the knee in submission to the radicals. Because if you don't, you lose your jobs, you'll be shamed, you'll be vilified, you'll be marginalized in one way or another, and in some instances, of course, in other countries, you'll be jailed because you must go along with the ideology. It trumps everything, and woe to those who stand against it. Let's not be critical. Let's not be critical of those who have gone before us. Many of them have survived. Many Christians have bowed the knee. Now, where do we go from here? As Christians, what we need to do is to separate the legitimate protesters and their concerns from the radicals that have exploited all of this. And we have to ask ourselves, what can we do better, and how can we as a church help? I love what Tony Evans has said. He said that the real answer is we have to begin with relationships. He said, find someone who is poorer than you, who is less than you, maybe someone of a different race. Befriend them, get to know them. Let's hear from them. And then what we can do through establishing the relationships is to build on that. And you know what? I don't think there's any other way to overcome some of the problems and some of the legitimate issues that we face in America. And then he talks about the church, the need to demonstrate reconciliation. And I have preached about this many times, Ephesians chapter 2, that in Jesus Christ, He has made us one. And we here at the Moody Church celebrate the fact that we have so many people from at least 70 different countries of origin. We believe so strongly in the vision of Revelation, where there are people from every tribe and tongue and nation. And the impact of the church has to then go beyond our communities. But the simple fact is we need to realize that oftentimes it is the protesters, the ones who become the radicals, that have shamed the whole process. Let's be wise in our responses, but let us also see that things are happening in our culture that should trouble us deeply. I won't mention any more right here, but if you watch the news, you can make your own list. Let me now go to another continuing effect, and that is what I have called a global technocratic dictatorship. Now I have to read that again also. A global technocratic dictatorship. You know, that word technocratic means that we will eventually, they will want to control us, An elite number will want to control us through a network of technological and political forces that will track our movements, that will take care of us, that will know where we shop, what we have bought, what the websites are that we visit. All of that will be known. There are three things that are coming together that I think may be a picture of the future. You know, when I read the book of Revelation, I read it some time ago just to see the kinds of things that are listed there that we can already see now. I think that what we are seeing in our culture, in our world today, are really a preview of what is coming in the future. And I see three things coming together. First of all, you have the pandemic, which of course has caused a lot of fear, as we have emphasized. Secondly, you have technology. And third, you have the economy. In an article entitled ID 2020, are you acquainted with that organization, by the way? ID 2020, the headline is, ID 2020 launches technical certificate mark. The organization brings together all these various branches that I've talked about and insists that every human being be given a digital, let me read that again, a digital certificate as a mark of legal identity that would ensure that each person is properly identified. And it goes on to say how that this will unite the world, the rich will help the poor, and so forth, so it has economic implications. And what else? I'll read directly from their website. But with the application process developed for the certification mark, we will have enough data points and input to take a pretty good snapshot. And if we ever learn about or suspect non-compliance or foul play, we will reserve the right to revoke the certificate. Let me say that again. We will reserve the right to revoke the certification. And you know what? You can't argue with a computer. If they revoke you, you are revoked. I think, for example, of contact tracers. Our own mayor here in the city of Chicago announced that she was allocating $56 million to train 600 contact tracers. Now, this is because of the virus. What that means is that with the digital components, you will know and be contacted if you have been in contact with someone who may be contagious. And what we have to do is to ask ourselves, how does all this work? But technology is certainly way beyond what many of us can understand. But that's where it's actually leading us. We're not there yet, but we're on our way. In fact, I read one article that said we will even know where you sat in the theater and who there was around you. Now think about that. What I've emphasized already is you have technology, you have economics, and then you have fear of the virus. Just wait until we find a solution. Wait until we get a vaccine, and then we will see what happens. Will it be that everyone will be expected to be vaccinated? Well, keep tuned, stay tuned as to what is happening. Now you ask the question, is this a fulfillment of Revelation chapter 13? I won't read the text, I think you know it. It says that the beast is going to control the small and the great and everyone, and you will not be able to buy or sell unless you have the mark of the beast. In previous times, it was believed that this was maybe a tattoo or some kind of a different mark on the skin. Now we can understand very clearly that it could be a digital certificate. And unless you have this microchip, which is being talked about, you will not be able to buy or sell. There will be no money. Everything will be digital. Everything will be electronic. And the question that we have to ask is what we are seeing today a picture of the future? Now, I don't believe that if you give away your information for contact tracing, that means you're worshiping the beast, or even that you will. I think that when the beast arrives, we will know that he is the beast. And many of us actually believe that this will happen perhaps after the rapture of the church. Be that as it may, let me ask you a question. Are you and I prepared to stand up for what we believe, or will we regard our own lives more important than faithfulness to the Lord? You know, in the 12th chapter of the book of Revelation, this is a glorious passage. It says, they overcame him, it says, by the word of their testimony and the blood of the Lamb. And then they said, because they did not regard their life unto death. Revolutionaries know this. You can survive without freedom, but you can't survive without food. And if you take away people's food, they will gladly give up freedom. So the question is, the martyrs of the future, the Bible says, they were willing to give up their lives, namely to give up food, and would not submit even under pressure. I want to encourage you, let's make up our minds in advance that no matter how difficult the times may be that we are entering, that we have a relationship with God that is strong enough to survive whatever comes our way, and to have the wisdom to know what we can submit to and what we can't submit to, and know the difference, and be willing to pay the price. You say, well, Pastor Lutzer, all that is rather negative. Yes, it is, but I want to give you some hope that will enable you to make it all the way to the finish line. You know, frequently, as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, preachers give the impression that if we trust God, everything is going to turn out well. You'll get your job back. You'll be able to pay for your rent. How wonderful it will be. Well, what if that doesn't happen? What if you don't get your job back? What if God doesn't heal you? What if you have a series of disappointments? Where do you go then? The kind of hope that we need is the kind of hope that survives even the most difficult and bitter experiences, and no matter how hard it gets. When you look at hope in the New Testament, what you discover is it is never hope in this life. It speaks about hope in the life to come. It's always forward-looking. I love this passage. There are many passages in the Bible I love, but here's one of them. Namely, the 6th chapter of the book of Hebrews. It says this, we have fled for safety, that we might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. There's the hope. We have this hope, it says, sure and steadfast, an anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain, where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. Here's the imagery. A forerunner is someone who would hop into the ocean as a boat neared the shore, and then with the means of an ancient winch would help bring the boat in so that it wouldn't get dashed against the rocks. That's a forerunner. Jesus, the Bible says, has gone ahead of us, and he is in heaven behind the curtain. And what he is really saying to us, look, I made it through Gethsemane. I made it through the cross. I made it through when I was betrayed. I was willing to give up my life. I didn't think that my life was the most valuable thing. Doing God's will was more valuable than my life. I endured it, and you can endure it too. I think we have a very dark future here in America, actually. I see too many things coming together that are very troubling. But God wants to give us a hope that is so strong that we can make it. Do you know the name Frances Chadwick? 1952, she was a very famous swimmer. She wanted to swim from Catalina Island all the way to the California coast, 21 miles. She tried it, and as she was going along, she became so weary, and the fog was so thick that she begged to be taken out of the water. The people on the boat who were tracking her said, just endure it. She said, I can't. They took her out of the water. What she discovered is that very soon she'd have been at the shore. And she said later, if I had had the shoreline in my mind, I would have been able to make it. 2 months later, in the midst of the same fog, at the same place, the same 21-mile distance, she began to swim, and she made it. And she said, I kept an image of the shoreline in mind. My friend, today, amidst all the buzz that is happening, all the news that keeps being shouted at us, will you be sure to keep the shoreline in mind? Jesus, for the hope that was set before him, the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despised the shame, and he's in heaven waiting, saying, I'm here for you. I did it, and you can too. Thanks so much for joining us today, and I hope that this has been informative, and especially I hope and pray that it's been a blessing. God bless you. Remain faithful and keep the shoreline in mind.